Hello, my name is Rónán and I'm from the Law School in NUI Galway. I'm also one of the co-organisers of today's event. My presentation is on a review that I carried out of the Non-Statutory Judicial Studies Committee in 2019. This is useful by way of context for the discussion we're going to have on the work of the Statutory Judicial Studies Committee into the future. And actually, a lot of my presentation is going to be more about context perhaps than about the actual content of the review. But nonetheless, I think it's all useful by way of background to what we're going to talk about today. A little bit of background on myself and my involvement, my interest in this area. I worked as Executive Legal Officer to the Chief Justice from 2000 to 2004. Chief Justice Rónán was Chief Justice at the time. And in that capacity, I would attend events that were being run by what was then called the Judicial Studies Institute. Again, another level of confusion in the history here. The Judicial Institute was a non-statutory committee of judges set up to deal with judicial education and training from about 1995 on. And that later renamed itself to the Judicial Studies Committee and has continued in that non-statutory capacity. But there is also now this new Statutory Judicial Studies Committee. But all three really refer to judicial education and training in Ireland. So it would attend the various events that the JSI would run. I was the first editor of the Judicial Studies Institute Journal, now known as the Irish Judicial Studies Journal, and actually co-edited by Dr. Laura Cahalane, the co-organiser of today's event. And in that capacity, I suggested to the Chief Justice and to the board of the Institute that the work of the Institute should really be reviewed. And a tender for that was prepared, and the successful bidder on the tender was the University of Limerick. And if everything has gone to plan in terms of the presentation recordings for today, you should also have heard from Professor Paul McCutcheon about his work on that review in 2003. In 2019, I was asked by the then Chief Justice and still current Chief Justice of Ireland, Mr. Justice Frank Clark, to update that 2003 review in anticipation of the enactment of the Judicial Council Act, which would put judicial education and training in Ireland on a statutory footing. And what did I do when I did that? I engaged in some desk research to update that report. I conducted study visits to Northern Ireland, to Scotland and to France. I was keen to include a civil law country in what I was doing. And in the process, from suggestions that people made to me, I also contacted a range of people who are involved in judicial education and training in a number of other countries and jurisdictions within other countries, Canada, New York, the state of Victoria in Australia, New Zealand, and also the Netherlands. And I also conducted interviews with Irish judges at all levels, at least 2 judges from each court level, sometimes 3 or more. And I developed some proposals for how education and training should be improved in the future, and some costings for this in order to assist the Council in developing its budgetary plans. A little bit about the context within which all of this was taking place. As I mentioned, the Judicial Council Act was impending when I was commissioned to conduct this review. And as it happened, the enactment of that legislation actually moved quite faster than had been anticipated. But the Council has a number of different functions. Some of them are around the education of justice, the education of judges, I should say, but also intended to promote excellence on the part of judges to ensure that the judges are independent and to ensure that the public has confidence in the judiciary. And all of these things, I think, do have connections with judicial education and training and some of the issues that we might touch on later in the presentation and in the discussion during the day. The Council is also intended to manage schemes for education and training of judges and to disseminate information and materials to judges for use in their functions. And these are things that had been underway already by the Judicial Studies Committee, the non-statutory one, or by the Judges' Library, or by judicial researchers employed by the court service. There is then provision for the establishment of a statutory judicial studies committee, which is responsible for continuing education and training of judges. And that committee has a range of different topics, essentially, that it is directed by the legislation to focus on. There's a lot of text on that slide. I apologize for that. But I think it's worth just taking a moment to focus on the items that I've highlighted there. There are some provisions aimed at dealing with essentially the criminal justice process. There is what I think is a very useful focus on European Union law, international law, human rights and equality law. And then we have somewhat odd items inserted in there. Information technology is one of the items on which the judiciary seem to need training. And that is intended to be provided by the Judicial Studies Committee, but not by the Court Service, which is the body that actually administers and manages most, if not all, of the information technology that judges come into contact with. So it's a topic that doesn't really sit very well in there. And then the assessment of damage and damages in respect of personal injuries, that's probably there because the Council also has a responsibility for re-examining and perhaps revising the levels of damages for personal injuries. But it's interesting that that's the only civil law matter that is dealt with there. And although we have trials for jury in some very limited circumstances in civil proceedings, that's not actually something that the legislature think that the judiciary need to focus on. Now, that's not an exhaustive list. The Judicial Studies Committee can work on a lot of other things, but it's interesting to focus for a moment on the fact that that is what the legislature think that the judiciary need training on. It may not be what the judges themselves think. In any case, as I said, I conducted some research to see what the state of education and training in Ireland was. And this, bear in mind, is a snapshot in 2019. A great deal has actually changed since then. But very little of the 2004 report prepared by the University of Limerick had been implemented. The journal was still ongoing. The style of training had not really changed all that much. The focus was still on plenary lecture style conferences, some somewhat less formal events taking place, particularly at the district and circuit court level. And some of these were being webcast for judges based around the country. There was regular attendance by judges at events in other jurisdictions, and these were found to be quite useful. But the focus was generally on substantive law topics and not so much on skills, and the speakers tended to be external experts and not judges. And I should have said maybe at the outset, but I have no great expertise in judicial education and training. It's just a topic that has interested me since my time working with the Chief Justice in the early 2000s. But in the process of preparing the report, I did some reading around, and one quote that I came across from a European Judicial Training Network seemed to summarize essentially the tenor of a lot of the conversations I was having with experts from other jurisdictions. Again, quite a lot of text on the slide. Please don't read it in detail. I've highlighted a few different things, but the focus seems to be moving much more to interactivity, moving towards more varied training methods, focusing on the development of skills in a practice-oriented way, focusing on the discussion of individual experience, dealing with real-world problems, and at the time, this is 2016, a realization that online training could be quite useful, but still not a lot of understanding of how best that could be done. So I concluded that there are now lists of agreed principles developed by the European Judicial Training Network and the International Organization for the Judicial Training, that there was a need to ensure that trainers themselves were in fact trained. Very much a focus internationally on participatory training, in other words, interactive discussions rather than a plenary lecture style. And then many new topics that come up since the early 2000s have focused on judicial wellness, on issues around unconscious bias, on how to deal with lay litigants, and how to deal with vulnerable individuals. These are topics that we may come back to over the course of the day. And there are things that certainly were very much at the fore of concerns in 2019. As I said, I spoke to a lot of judges, and what I found was that they were generally unhappy with the education and training that they were being provided. There was a lack of time available to attend training events. We simply don't seem to have enough judges in Ireland. There's too much work to go around. They felt that there was a need for a structured induction program and perhaps a staggered follow-up as well after maybe 6 months or 12 months and so on, particularly at the superior courts levels where initial induction seemed to be quite informal. There was a need for a mentoring program. Judges were generally quite enthusiastic about the specialised training that they were getting and the opportunities to attend continual professional development programs externally. But they generally had moved from the focus on substantive law topics that had been the case in the early 2000s to really wanting to hear about skills. And one very significant change from the 2003-2004 report is that in that report, there was a reluctance to engage in online training. That really seems to have shifted, and there was, I wouldn't say universal, but quite considerable enthusiasm for online training in 2019. And to conclude, I suppose, and to bring the story up to date, I just want to highlight some developments since then, and I have no involvement with these, but the Judicial Council recently published its first annual report, and these are some highlights from that on the general topic of judicial education and training. We had hoped to have a speaker from the Judicial Studies Committee at today's event, but that has proved not to be possible. So again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the committee here. I have no great insight into this beyond what is actually in the report, but nonetheless, in terms of bringing the story up to date, I think it's worth considering this. And in their 2020 report, the Judicial Studies Committee highlight that they have appointed now a part-time director of judicial studies, Ms. Justice Mary Rose Gearty of the High Court, who has, it seems, doing quite a lot of work to really move things forward. A training needs analysis has been conducted. Proper induction program has been developed and provided. Judges have been trained in providing mentoring, and that mentoring, for the sense of it, is probably underway now. It was to be provided from 2021 on, so that new judges coming in will be mentored by judges who have training in how to provide mentoring. The focus is on the recommendations from the review of protections for vulnerable witnesses in the investigation and prosecution of sexual offences, which is a report that was led on by my colleague, Tom O'Malley, who you will be hearing from later on in the event. And also there has been a lot of work done looking at the possibility of digitising training, of providing online training, which is something that I think is relatively commonplace in other jurisdictions. And there were already something that was already underway in Ireland, and I would guess has been accelerated quite considerably by the pandemic and the shift to so much to be online over the past year and a half. So that brings the story more or less up to date in terms of judicial training in Ireland and where it stands at present. And in the rest of the day, we can perhaps talk about how that story can be brought forward and improved more. Thank you.